So, welcome back to the Contrarians. We are back at it again. We have another panel discussion for you. This time we're going to be discussing Blue Öyster Cult again, so sort of a channel favorite band. We're going to be discussing the album Imaginos. Before we get started, if you like the Contrarians, if you like what you see, if you want to join the conversation, please like and subscribe, share with your friends. There's a Patreon if you want to get in on the Patreon chats. There's a TeePublic, and there's a Ko-fi if you want to provide support that way. Details for all of that is in the description below, so please check it out if you want to help support the channel. But most importantly, just want to thank you for being here, and we're going to dive right into it. Imaginos. This is the 11th studio album by Blue Öyster Cult. It was released in 1988. And generally from what I saw on a little bit of research, I'll be honest, I didn't have time to do a lot today. Sorry, everyone, but I'm sure we have an expert panel here who can really fill you in. From what I saw, this album is not usually considered too high on the list. However, it's got a couple of my favorite songs on it, which is sort of a surprising thing for me. Like personally, I really love astronomy, so I'll be interested to hear what the panel has to say today. So I'm going to throw it over to Martin to start. Martin can provide a little bit more in-depth information. He'll give his review, and we'll just keep going along from there in no particular order. So Martin, I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, okay. So I'll give a little background, but then we'll turn it over to someone else for their reviews, and I'll do my review later on, kind of thing. So I'll try to break it into two pieces here. But yeah, so essentially Sandy Pearlman, the mastermind of the band, in the late 60s, he had this sketch worked out for this elaborate story. He was a big H.P. Lovecraft fan, so it's kind of a sci-fi story. But one missive he put out there that kind of taints everybody's view, and I'll get to it in a minute how important it was in my view of this thing, was that it was a story that attempted to explain the occult origins of World War I. So there's this whole idea of the old ones, the Invisibles, Les Invisibles, they're essentially fish people, like the whole Cthulhu mythos situation with Lovecraft. But there's this character. He's kind of a supernatural character. He's a shapeshifter. He comes in and out of things. He travels a lot. He's in Cornwall, England. He goes to Haiti, and he's part of the whole. He's inserted into kind of the voodoo story. And then he's back. So he's kind of all over the place. He's in New England because that's, quote unquote, Lovecraft country. And, we've got to remember Blue Öyster Cult's got the Long Island, the Stony Brook, the RISD, the Rhode Island School of Design situation. All of this is all that's mainly Lovecraft country, although he went to New York as well. But so Sandy had this story sketch, essentially notes. It's kind of hard to figure out exactly how much he had because, we haven't seen it. But, the story goes that there'd be a binder that would sit on an amp, and any member, if they're feeling like, creatively blocked, could go up and take a run at trying to put a story together with some of these Imaginos lyrics. So over the course of a whole bunch of albums, there's songs that to a greater or lesser extent are part of the Imaginos saga. So flash forward to the early 80s, Albert's out of the band and he takes it upon himself and he goes off with Sandy and says, let's do the big, the double album, Imagnios album, and let's do it properly. And let's bring in these other songs like Gil Blanco County and the girl that made Love Blind, I think it's called. And let's make this big album. And they worked on it and it wasn't going well, and they ran out of money, and CBS was upset at them and all this stuff. And then eventually CBS, years went by and they were saying, I'm getting this roughly right, I hope, but they're essentially saying, well, we really don't want you to sing the thing. This is a famous thing with Albert, and let's turn it into a Blue Öyster Cult project and bring the other guys in. And then there were a bunch of session musicians and Tommy Zavonchek and Joe Satriani and all these different guys, John Rogers. So they're all part of the thing. They're putting this record together. The band isn't really the band. They've kind of more or less broken up after Club Ninja 1986. And by the way, so yeah, I've done this Blue Öyster Cult book that's in its third incarnation, Agents of Fortune, and I would say yeah, there's the very early one. Very cool, Wild Bill. And there's also the early one. So there was one in between where it was called well, actually, is it the same title? Secrets Revealed or whatever. It's the same title later, but different cover. But this is the one that came out through Weimer. He went and renamed it Agents of Fortune, the Boy Scout story. But in here, you get pretty much the most elaborate explanation of the whole Imagnios story and the album, this very complicated album from both Sandy and Albert. Sandy is no longer with us. He died a few years ago. And then, of course, I went and did Flaming Telepaths, Imagnios Expanded and Specified, which is it's a timeline book throughout, and then I did these 39 illustrations for it as well. And it goes way into the whole thing and really expands on it. It brings in more stuff about John Dee and the Magna of Illusion. I bring in Austin Osman Spare, and I bring in Churchill and Marston and all these guys that were, really leading up to World War I and the occult origins of World War I. The Serbian Black Hand. I've got pictures of the Led Zeppelin object in here because to me, the Led Zeppelin object is kind of a neat updated version of John Dee and the Magna of Illusion, the obsidian mirror, where you stare into it and get spirits and all this. Lots of alchemy in here, lots of alchemy in the original story, heavy metal, black and silver, all that sort of stuff. A lot of New England stuff, a lot of Crowley. I put a lot of Crowley in here as well. So this is just a big, huge, complicated, massive expansion of the idea and a reimagining and adding a whole lot to it. So I did that as well. And then, of course, we know Albert has done Imagnios and Imagnios 2. He's done the two albums as sort of acoustic sort of thing. So I guess just finishing up, what else could I say? So yeah, it's got the Cliff House on the cover, and I use the Cliff House on many of the illustrations in there. Inside, outside, meetings, the place burning down, the Sutro baths next door. But the Cliff House really isn't a big part of the Imagnios story. It just kind of, I brought it in because it's also on the cover of this, right? But yeah, so this record came out, and it's a concept album, of course. They mixed the order around. It was already a very confusing story to understand. It got knocked down to a single album because they essentially ran out of money and ran out of patience and all this. And like I said, there's a lot of guest stars. There's even a couple of guest vocals on it. And so, yeah, after this, they lost their deal and they never had a major label deal again. The album didn't do well out there. So, yeah, it's very complicated history to this thing. They update a couple of songs and put them on here. But this was supposed to be the big, let's bring everything in, the double album story. Let's put the story together. And it was mostly Sandy and Albert doing it. Then Albert had to, kind of sue for his production credit to be restored on this thing because he did a lot of production on it. And it's kind of a big complicated mess on the production as well, because so much of this stuff, it's hard to tell what sessions they come from, but it's kind of all over the years. So yeah, July 88, Kingdom Sound, Boogie Hotel, Alpha and Omega Studios. That was Sandy's studio that he had out in San Francisco. He was a New England guy, a San Francisco guy, and even taught in Montreal. And amazing guy to interview. His stories are so cool because he's such an intellectual and goes deep into this stuff, and he does it very rapidly. So, like I say, probably the best chunk of having Sandy explain any of this is actually in the normal book. So there you go. I'm going to stop there and not give my review of the album, and I'll turn it over. Nick, turn it over to whoever you would like.
All right. Well, I think we're going to go over to Jamie, but first, just to let everyone know at home, although I'm sure everyone knows by now, you can find Martin's books at martinpopoff.com. Yeah, thanks, Martin. Excellent as always, and we'll look forward to your review later on in the episode. So I'm going to hand it over to the master of the physical media, Jamie. Why don't you tell the folks at home if there's any new viewers where they can find you, and let's hear your review.
All right, Jamie Laszlo. You can find me on Sea of Tranquility sometimes. You can find me here on the Contrarians sometimes. I have a Facebook page called Let's Get Physical, which is all about physical media. And you just post stuff and we look at the stuff you bought and we say, that's cool. And that's it. That's the premise. And it works beautifully. Anyways, this album. I bought this album as an 18-year-old when it first came out. just a dumb 18-year-old. Now I'm a dumb 52-year-old. I had no idea the backstory or on how it was recorded, how they were barely in the same room together. I didn't know the premise of the story of there is an hour and 40-minute video on YouTube. And I watched it all.
Excellent.
I watched the whole damn thing, and I didn't understand one word. Not one word about the story of this album. You know why Martin is so damn smart? Not only did he understand the video, he wrote a damn book on it that's probably over my head that would confuse me even more. So if I ever buy another book, Martin, that won't be one because I'm just too dumb for it. But the album itself, I've always sensed, even when I was a teenager, there's a mystique about this album. Couldn't put my finger on it. Maybe it's the cover. Maybe it's the crazy names of the songs, or the chanting that's kind of comes and goes on some of the songs. 7777. It's got this weird thing about it, a weird vibe, and I always loved it. And I always said this album and Mirrors are my two favorite BOC albums, and it goes back and forth. And because of watching that confusing video and because of listening to it a few times on my vinyl the last few days, this is now above Mirrors. But yeah, I love this album. I am the one you warned me of. It's the name of a song that you shouldn't remember, but somehow it rolls off the tongue and it rocks. Lay Invisible, that's got the 7777. I don't know what the hell they're singing about, but I love it. In the Presence of Another World, it's got Your Master. This album just has that weird chanting going on throughout it in some of the songs, but it's infectious chanting that's catchy, that gets stuck in your head. Del Rio's song could be annoying if someone else recorded it. I did hear the original by Bouchard. Yeah, BOC does it a lot better. It's on the verge of being annoying, but it's not. It's still very good. Maybe my least favorite on the album. And then you got the Siege and Investure of Baron von Frankenstein's Castle at Wyceria. I'm never going to remember. I never remember that title, but my God, it's so epic. And this guy who sings it, Joe Sorsano, he's actually made a living in the 80s. We've all heard him. He did jingles for Miller and Joined the Navy and Sprite and Mountain Dew and Ever Ready. And he auditioned for Black Sabbath, too. I watched a little thing on YouTube about him. I prepared for tonight. I prepared. Damn it. But he kills that song, man. Kills it. And it's got this big, epic, proggy ending. Astronomy. Yes, they did it on Secret Treaties. Eric Bloom sang it the first time. And it's kind of garage rocky. You know, it's off the first three albums, you know, when they were a little bit proto-metal. But here, people say this album is overproduced. I think it needs it for the layers and the textures and the hey, more chanting. It just works better when it's well produced instead of garage rocky. And I like Buck Dharma's vocals on it better because he just adds that mystique. And Magna of Illusion, it sounds like a history lesson when he's singing it to me, like I need to take notes. And it was telling me as an 18-year-old, something's going on here with this album, and it's smarter than me. And that's why I like it. Öyster Cult, great song. And it's got that we understand chant. Always got that chanting. And then Imaginos is just an earworm. Ooh, Imaginos. It shouldn't be. I know Columbia rearranged the songs. That should not have been the last one. It sounds like an introduction to the album, if you ask me. And I think it was originally like track 2. They should have kept it at track 2. And it should have ended with the big, epic Blue Oyster Call, which I think is like 7 minutes long. That's the way to end it. But yeah, it's still, I love it to death.
Nice. Very cool.
Awesome. Yeah. I guess if you had to give it a ranking out of 10, what would you give it?
Ooh, yeah. Oh, I'd give this thing I might, you know what? Ask me a month ago, I would have said an 8. I'm going 9. Hell with it. 9.
9. All right. Starting off strong. That's great. Well, Thank you very much, Jamie. And we're going to keep things rolling right along. We're going to go over to Nick. So, Nick, the podium is yours.
Thanks, Nick. I wish that Martin had done the press and the marketing and the liner notes for this album, because he was clear and succinct, and I learned a ton. As opposed to reading the liner notes when I bought this on cassette when it came out in the summer of '88. And of course, there's a paucity of information about this album on, in magazines or on MTV or whatever. So I didn't know much about it. And of course, reading the liner notes, they're impenetrable. They're impossible to understand. For me, it was like I described it as a fever dream wrapped up in a word salad. It was really just brutal. And as I think Jamie alluded to, just like put the concept aside and just listen to the music. And it's really good. And I'm a little embarrassed because, this was on cassette. I never picked it up on CD, so I kind of forgotten about the album. But reviewing it in the last week or so, I know all the songs, love the songs. It really, really good stuff. At the time when this came out in '88, this album may have been a step behind of what was going on. For example, Metallica and Justice for All and Living Colors putting out Vivid, and Jane's Addiction is out there. So there's like new sounds out there. This may have been a step behind, but this album was also better than a lot of the contemporaries that still put out albums during this time period. I mean, this album blows away Crazy Nights. Blows away Love Is for Suckers. A lot of the bands from the 70s weren't even pumping anything out. Now, Aerosmith had Permanent Vacation, but I think now, 30-some years later, I'd rather Imaginos than Permanent Vacation. So, and I'm not sure. I think this stands up well with other things out there. I was taking a gander, like Bad Company's Dangerous Age and Cheap Trick's Lap of Luxury. And so this Joan Jett's up your alley. So this stands well. So it didn't deserve the fate that it got. So it was a marketing disaster. It was, and the band probably didn't do it any favors either. I understand, they played a few songs live, but the guest vocalist didn't come out on the road with them. And to cut to it, I think Siege and Investiture is one of my top 5 BOC songs. I love that song. It's bombastic. The piano is like holy Jim Steinman. The vocals are like Ronnie James Dio, but more range. I thought that song could even be a single, even though it's kind of an odd subject matter, screaming about Frankenstein. But I just think the energy and intensity of that song is just unequaled. When this came out, I knew this to be a project. I knew that there's more people on it. I knew that I didn't realize that BLC was in such disarray. I just knew that they were bringing in people and they had these guys on it singing. But that was all I kind of knew about it, and that was it. But nonetheless, I just thought that this album deserved a better fate than what it's got. I think it holds up over time. And to cut to the chase, I know we have to keep it moving, but I'd give this album an 8. I think it's in the if not the top of the top tier of BOC albums, it's in the next level down. But it might be in my top tier if I had 2 or 3 albums. So it's probably my top 3 BOC albums.
Nice.
Awesome. All right. Well, yeah, great job. Thanks, Nick. We're going to keep it rolling right along. We're going to go over to Bill next. So, Bill, the floor is yours.
All right. Much like Nick, I bought this when it came out in '88 on cassette. I was 20 at the time, and those liner notes were a mess. It was clear the record company was trying to make it look like the original band was back together the way they had the credits, but it was kind of bizarre because Joe was playing keyboards, no bass. Things just didn't quite look right, but of course we had no idea. And I remember an episode of Rockline at the time where Don and Eric had gone on and done an interview. I used to have the cassette. I wish I still had it because it was hilarious. Eric was clearly under the influence of something at the time. And he even alluded to that in the interview. But they essentially seemed to make it as though this was just their current new BOC album, and there was not this messy backstory behind it. They didn't really go into any detail, to my recollection, of Albert's long involvement. And, at the time, none of us had any idea. So years later, circa 2000, I go online and I find a wonderful internet resource by a guy named John Swartz called the BOC FAQ. And that's where I first discovered the basic story And then 4 years later, I got Martin's book, and it went into greater detail. And as a side note, that book absolutely killed my Blue Oyster Cult mythology. Thank you, Martin. Every illusion that I had about these guys was brought down to earth, but it's such a great book. It taught me so much about them, and I still love it, even though I was kind of disgruntled that they're not quite the legends that I had thought in my younger days. I think this album still holds up for me. As Jamie said, the production is big and it needs to be. I wouldn't want every Blue Oyster Cult album to be this overproduced and this big and bombastic, but for this project, which again is not really a Blue Oyster Cult album while simultaneously being the ultimate Blue Oyster Cult album due to its origins, the production is perfect for this. I love the big over the top. Again, like Jamie said, also the chants. I love the as cheesy as it is, and yes, it's very much right there with the BOC, you got the power, we got the key. The chant of the band stating their name over and over in that updated version of Subhuman, Blue Oyster Cult. I love it. It's ultimate cheese, but I like a little cheese in my Blue Oyster Cult, so I'm okay with that. I like the fact that they have these different eras and that this is an odd little side trip, really. But I would like to definitely expand a bit on what Martin mentioned. I want to make sure to give Albert plenty of credit here because this has been his baby for literally decades. He's been a tireless champion for this, and I'd like to definitely pimp these albums a little bit. These are the two reworkings that Albert's released so far. They are nothing like the Imaginos album that originally came out. As Martin said, they are more acoustically oriented, but they're really cool reworkings of the original songs in addition to many other Blue Oyster Cult songs and some hidden gems that had only previously come out, like on Brain Surgeon's albums, Albert's previous band. Like we had the original version of The Girl That Love Made Blind on this Brain Surgeon's Malpractice album. That was the first time I ever heard that song. And then Albert redid it again for Reimaginos. And there are many guest stars on these albums that you have Buck Dharma, Eric Bloom, Joe Bouchard, Joey Sarazano, who of course did The Siege and Investiture on the original Imaginos album. He does a version of Quicklime Girl, of all things, on the second volume here. But it's cool to have all these people coming back together to reimagine this concept. And it's nice to see that these guys are still able to be civil with each other, that all that water's under the bridge and that they're able to actually join in on each other's projects and take part in this. I like seeing that. There's also, if you search YouTube, Albert's, it's listed as his original demos, but according to Albert himself, it's not the demos, it's the rough mix. So he has been very clear stating that his vocals on that were not meant to be final. Whether that had anything to do with what the record company thought, I have no idea. I'm not sure if that's what they heard or if they heard the actual demos, but he did definitely state that, yeah, don't judge it based on these. But it's still really cool to go listen to that original version, just if you're a fan of this material, just to hear different aspects of it and what it was like before it was all tarted up with the production and the extra guest stars and Buck and Eric's vocals. If I were to actually rate this album, I'm not going to say it's my favorite Blue Oyster Cult album, but I do rate it very highly. But again, I kind of don't consider it a Blue Oyster Cult album, so that's kind of a tough question. But numerically, I'm kind of going to go with Jamie here based on my enjoyment of listening to this a number of times this week, and I'm going to give it a 9. It was pure pleasure. I'll take that 10th star off there just because it's such a chaotic mess and there are minor irritations with it. But for a listening experience, yeah, it's great.
Cool.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks, Bill. So we've definitely we're seeing a trend forming here. Let's see if we can keep it going, or if it gets derailed. Reed, we're going to throw it over to you.
Well, I think it's fair to say I come at this album from a different place. I have a very different perspective on it. As I've mentioned in previous Blue Oyster Cult related things, I was not a historical fan of the band. They simply were not metal enough for me. I knew the singles, and I had a college roommate who had a cassette of Fire of Unknown Origins that he played constantly, and I do mean constantly. He only had 2 albums, that and the Ted Nugent album, and he played them in heavy rotation all the time. So I was not really a fan of Blue Oyster Cult until 2 years ago, when I got back into collecting CDs and decided to pick up the Blue Oyster Cult Columbia Albums collection. So this is literally going, from 0 to 60. It's every album they put out with Columbia Records. And absorbing a band that way is a lot like binging a show on Netflix in its entirety, right? It's good and bad. It's good because there's no particular era of Blue Oyster Cult that in my mind is the correct era, right? There's no, they should have sounded like this, and the rest of it didn't sound like that, so it doesn't sound right. On the other hand, it really throws into stark relief the pluses and minuses of things as you go along. So I am a big nerd, have been a big nerd my whole life. I love occult stories, although I guarantee you that I don't know. I mean, no matter how many times you listen to Imaginos, you are going to know exactly nothing about the occult origins of World War I. You... I suppose it's in there, but you really have to read between some lines and look under some rocks. I enjoyed Martin's book, Flaming Telepaths. I did not bring it in to hold up for the camera, but give it my biggest recommendation. It's a lot of fun. Great illustrations. But reading it, you still won't understand the occult origins of World War I. It's a very loose concept. It's like trying to find out the entire story of Ziggy Stardust from the Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars. It's just not there.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that the songs aren't good. Now, after listening to the entire catalog, my first thought listening to Imaginos was, this sounds like Toto. And I've actually read reviews that said this was Blue Oyster Cult's most metal album. And I went, what? In what freaking universe is this their most metal album? Now, The Siege and Investiture of Baron von Frankenstein is their most metal song, possibly with the exception of some stuff off of Heaven Forbid. But the rest of the album is not metal. They pull back the intensity at every turn. The vocals are not metal intense. The music is not metal intense. So I would not say that this is a metal album at all, despite that one really heavy track. I'm annoyed that they kept the vocals from 2 people who aren't in the band. And yeah, Joe Sarazano does a great job singing The Siege and Investiture of Baron von Frankenstein. I don't give a shit. Pardon my language. He's not a member of the band. They should have taken his vocal off and put Eric Bloom on there. And yes, it would have been a very different song. Unquestionably, it would have been a different performance, but that doesn't mean it would have been a worse performance. And that way it would have felt much more like a band situation. Now, let me go back to the Toto thing. Toto is a band of phenomenal musicians that are not known in the wider musical world for having a particular sound because they're so good. They can sound like anything, right? Toto just produces whatever performance is necessary, which is why, Michael Jackson's Beat It is basically a Toto album with Michael Jackson singing, in case you didn't know that. And that's what I get from this album. It feels like really top-class studio musicians interpreting Blue Oyster Cult songs rather than a Blue Oyster Cult album. The easy comparison, because they have multiple versions, is Astronomy. The version of Astronomy on Secret Treaties is now one of my all-time favorite tracks. I love that track to death. And I think it's superior in every way to the version on Imaginos. I think Eric Bloom's vocal fits the song much better than Buck Dharma's. Buck has a very pretty, very pop sounding voice, which is fantastic because they normally have him sing the prettier, more pop sounding songs and they leave the rock tracks to Eric. And I think Eric's got the better vocal style for that song. But it's not just that. The version on Imaginos has got 100 different guitar parts in it. It's just layer on layer on layer on layer of guitar parts. It's got lead over lead over lead. There'll be like 5 or 6 lead lines going at the same time. And this is what people mean by overproduced. Now, I prefer I won't say the original is simplistic. It's not. It's still got layered guitars, but there's a lot less layers, right? And I do think the vocal fits it better. It's more intense. Plus, that it has my favorite moment in any BOC song, which is when they pull back, got a little piano, and then they ramp up the intensity again they sing Astronomy, a Star over and over and over again. You lose that entirely in the Imaginos version. It's all one intensity all the way through. And again, that's a studio arrangement. That's not the band because they have clearly a finished track that the band is coming to sing over. On the flip side, I love Blue Öyster Cult and think it's far superior to Subhuman off of Secret Treaties. Imaginos does have 2 songs that I think are terrible, which is Imaginos and Magna of Illusion. I just don't think those are very good songs. And finishing the album with Imaginos is a bummer. It's like, why put your worst song at the end? Now, I will say I own Albert Bouchard's Reimaginos. God bless him for trying. I don't like Albert's voice. I can't listen to him. Albert sounds exactly like what he is, which is a guy who didn't have a fantastic voice to begin with, and now he's 70 years old. And I mean, I give him all the props in the world for trying, but the result doesn't really do it for me. But if you take his song order and reorder the tracks on Imaginos, it actually goes, I Am the One You Warned Me Of, Del Rio Song, In the Presence of Another World, The Siege and Investiture of Baron von Frankenstein, Astronomy, Imaginos, Blue Öyster Cult, Magna of Illusion, and it ends with Les Invisibles. Les Invisibles is a fantastic song to end with. Like Jamie says with that chant, 7, 7, 7, 7. It is such a better way to end the album than with the weakest track on the album. And if you get a chance, go through and make yourself a playlist where you reorganize the songs according to the way Albert thinks that they should have been structured and see if that doesn't actually improve the flow of the album. I think it made a big difference. So in the end, I think it feels exactly like what it is. It's a studio album with some vocal performances by Blue Öyster Cult. It reminds me, it's functionally identical to like Metallica playing with a symphony. It doesn't really sound like Metallica. It sounds like a symphony with Metallica singing over top of it, right? And that's how I feel about this album. It's good, but as a Blue Öyster Cult album, I think it lacks. I prefer the non-studio musician Blue Öyster Cult albums. Now, that said, I still enjoy it. Out of 10, I'm going to give it a thematically appropriate 7, 7, 7, 7, 7, 7.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Reed. Great review as always. We're going to turn it over to Matt next. So, Matt, let's hear your review.
Hi, everyone. So I think that part of the pleasure of Imaginos is how hard you have to work for the information. And that we, as Blue Öyster Cult fans, so I'm kind of coming at it the opposite of Reed, right? So existing longtime fan before it came out, we heard hints, we heard rumors, right? In the very first album in the radio insert, Sandy mentions that Soft Doctrines of Imaginos is going to be the 4th Blue Öyster Cult album. It's mentioned in magazine articles, the Enemy in 1975. The songs get demoed for other versions. So and there's songs, of course, in the preceding Blue Öyster Cult albums that are Imaginos theme songs. So we're studying the green lined printouts for when we sent away for the lyrics. we're digging into it and trying to learn about this thing. But of course, it comes out and it's pre-internet, so I had no idea it was coming out. The first I heard of it was Astronomy played on the radio with the Stephen King introduction, which was really kind of mind-blowing. We knew the connection with The Stand at that point from the book, not the TV series. And, I rushed out, bought the record, and then you see that the band is back together. So I had recently seen them on the Club Ninja tour. We know that they weren't together, and now the band's back together and they're doing the Imaginos concept. So excited. Listen to the album. I'm not going to talk too much about how much I like or dislike about it, because I think you've all done a great job on that. There's kind of more sharing, I guess, how I think the journey of being a fan affects how you kind of interact with this album. So I see them on that tour, and my show and tell, I do have a shirt that I got from 1988, and it's kind of cool because it has the Stephen King part on the back with a bedtime story for the children of the damned on there. So the merchandise is very, very cool. They're only sort of touring albums. So immediately we find out that the band is not back together. So John Rogers and Ron Riddle are in the band. They play 3 songs from the album. I saw them a few times on that tour, but they play I Am the One You Warned Me Of. They play In the Presence of Another World, and they do the new version of Astronomy. So you do get to hear sort of a single version of the band read playing that song without all the layers, but in the new format. So that's kind of neat to hear. Well, then, you with being a fan of, or trying to dig into this Imaginos thing, right? You have to be like this esoteric eldritch investigator going through all the resources that you can find. And so I think after that album came out, there was kind of a cabal of researchers trying to really understand what was going on. Bill, you mentioned the John Swartz's FAQ. Even pre that, the BOCL listserv, Martin, that was when we first interacted. Everyone's sharing the conspiracy theories about, how this was going out. That's a lot of where John got his information. And John was a big leader on that group, trying to figure out what all this means. Later we start getting the Brain Surgeon album. So we start learning more about that. Bola Gregmar of the Museum of Cult and the Blue Öyster Cult fan club. Best wishes for Bola right now. He put out Morning Final with Melanie Murphy, which had a bunch of articles about Blue Öyster Cult album. So we're, learning more about all this stuff. I visited the Museum of Cult, got to hear demo versions of these things. Okay. So I think the question though, that then comes as you do, once you're you're in, right? Your head swimming with all this information. Well, it does exist as an album. There is a recording of this thing, right? And I kind of ask, you can play these what if questions, right? So the album was supposed to come out as the 4th Blue Öyster Cult album. Then they demoed a bunch of the songs for Spectres, and it could have been done at that time. Well, what would have happened had it been done as a sort of real Blue Öyster Cult album where they collaborated and it came out in the late 70s? What would that have done for their legacy? What would that have done for their popularity? I don't know, but it's an interesting thing to think about. But the question that I ask is, I'll just throw this out there for people to comment on maybe, but is it better if it didn't ever come out, right? So like the things that influenced it, the H.P. Lovecraft writings, right? The Necronomicon was way more interesting and cool before someone actually tried to publish a version of the Necronomicon. The King in Yellow, the fictitious play by Robert Chambers is interesting because it doesn't exist. The Beach Boys' Smile was probably more interesting before we got more actual versions of it. So and then just to tie it to the BOC thing. So the book, The Origins of a World War by Rossignol, right? Like that's way more interesting because it doesn't exist. And so there's a part of me that sort of thinks that Imaginos is a little bit better in our imaginations than it is in reality, because it was a huge compromise when it came out. That said, I'll just conclude with the Albert Bouchard version, I think is the most fully realized version of what the concept is, and to experience it that way. And one of the things that I kind of focus on is the intersection of rock music and tabletop role-playing games. And sorry for this, a little plug, but it ties in here. So I don't know if this is, yeah, it's probably not going to come up on here, but there's sorry, won't show. I've been working on a zine that's coming out. This is probably the best version I have of it, called Critical Hit Parader. And it's a zine that's coming out in February. The first issue is a Blue Öyster Cult themed issue. As I was writing this, I listened to Albert Bouchard's version for about 2 months straight every night as I was writing. And what happens if you absorb it that long is that it's sort of, you get the taste of the other versions you've heard out of your mouth, and you can kind of hear them for what they really are. First, 20 times listening to it, it's very hard to not hear the versions that you heard before. And I actually think it's a masterpiece. It's so good in terms of actually delivering on the concepts of Imaginos in a way that none of the other versions, including his own demos and rough cuts, I think this delivers it in a much better way. So excited for the third and final version of the trilogy for him to come out. So I know I've talked a lot. You guys know how I am about Blue Öyster Cult, so I'll leave it there.
I found a replica of that shirt online for $21.
Awesome.
Nice.
It's not mine. I'm not selling it.
Well, thanks, Matt. That was a really interesting viewpoint and great. If you gun to your head, out of 10, what would you say?
I can't look at it objectively, honestly. So it's 10 out of 10 for me. Every version, right? I've gotten so much out of it, and the more that I get into any version of it, I just get more. So it 10 out of 10 for me. Awesome.
Well, thanks, Matt. That was great. All right, we got 2 more left, and I think we can fit them in, even though we're on a bit of a tight schedule today. So we'll go to Rand, and then we'll finish off with Martin. So Rand, the floor is yours.
Hi there. I'm sorry I was late today. I had some problems getting in. I've been a fan of this album since it first came out. My best friend bought it on LP, and I asked him to tape it for me so I could listen to it driving around Eureka, California. And I've had it on the cassette. I never did buy the album, but I've always had it on cassette, and I love this album. And yesterday was Blue Öyster Cult Day. I listened to the album, and then I listened to Imaginos, and then I listened to Bombs Over Germany, and I watched the video that Jamie so thankfully provided the link to, and I was just immersed in this band all day long. And the conclusion that I came to was, yes, Union did the same thing 3 years later. They had the same kind of, well, you can't play, we'll get this guy, and it's weird. I didn't even know any of that existed. I love this album. I like every track. I think the Siege of, how do you say that? The Frankenstein thing is one of the coolest songs I've ever heard him doing. In fact, I listened to it today, and I thought it was Ronnie James Dio. Sounds just like, and absolutely love this album. And to make things fast for you, I'm going to give it a 10. I'm with Matt. I think it's a masterpiece. To me, this is their Dark Side of the Moon, or Animals, however you look at it. Close to the edge, but I really love it.
All right. Well, wow. Yeah, that was very concise. Well, thanks, Rand. That was awesome. All right. We'll keep it going then. Did any general last comments you want to give about it or anything like that?
Well, I don't understand why fans don't like it. I mean, to me, it's a prog album. It sounds more proggy than heavy metal, and if prog fans would love this if they were introduced to it the way I was, without any kind of knowledge about. And the only 3 albums that I own by these guys are the live albums. So, but I've seen them twice, and I love them. I think they're awesome band.
All right.
It is the highest ranked album on Prog Archives as far as Blue Öyster Cult albums go. So you're right on it, Rand.
Thank you.
There we go. Short and sweet. Well, thanks, Rand. All right. So without further ado, we will hand it over to Martin for the final word. So Martin, the floor is yours.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention a quick. I'll read a little bit of this. The 1829 entry from the book here, because it brings up a lot. It shows you kind of how deep down the rabbit hole you can go with this. And this is just page after page of this stuff. But anyways, it says, Imagnios, now 25, has been in New Orleans and is currently leaving that city on a boat is referenced at the end of Del Rio's song. As Albert Bouchard suggests, Del Rio is Imaginos, the alias suggesting his need for one due to the bad vibes he emits and also his shape-shifting mission. Crowley also visits New Orleans. There are links to Di Pasquale and Michael Bertio and the historical ties between the French and voodoo. France has always been one of the strongest markets for the Blue Öyster cult. New Orleans was sold by the French to the Americans. This band of Americans sold many records and concert tickets to the French. Albert Bouchard, essentially co-conspirator with Sandy Pearlman on the sounds and words totality of Imaginos, is called Del Rio's song the oldest song of the existing suite of Imaginos songs, given the reference to 1829. When Albert redid the album in 2020, wanting to put things back in order, he in fact acquiesced to the record company's suggestion to begin with I Am the One You Warned Me Of to match the opening of the 1988 album, which, as Albert has observed, doesn't really break any concrete chronological rules. In fact, given the vague poetry of the songs, Bouchard figures he could have started Reimaginos with Black Telescope, Blue Öyster Cult, or Imaginos. There's a line in the song, when time gets slow and rivers freeze, which evokes a number of messages. River reminds us of water, which is Imaginos' way home. Freezing rivers will reflect like a mirror, subtly like the glass in a telescope, and like the eyes, especially of black. Time slowing down is a phenomenon or effect that is felt in times of trauma, which is about to come in the form of the American Civil War and World War I. The suggestion here, explained artfully but obscurely in the following lines, is that at this juncture, the collective psyche will be attuned to both the inner gain and outer frame. Eyes will open, paralleling the various versions of Imaginos as temporarily blind, represented by the line opens up the way to blind man's bluff. Later in the song, there are eyes that glow like coals. Finally, there's the contrast between time being frozen and the river representing the inexorable rush and passing of time. In this respect, ice is the same thing as a photograph. So, yeah, I mean, there's lots of that in and out throughout this thing, and it's all timeline entries, bringing in lots of Crowley and all this sort of. So there's a lot of depth to this, and as Matt has eloquently explained, you can really go down the rabbit hole and find a lot of cool stuff and tie a lot of things together. Just so my review of the album. I'm probably going to give it the lowest grade of everybody here because I am a big production guy, and I really find it kind of screechy and overbearing and big booming drums on it and distorted, and the production kind of varies throughout the album. You know, I want a heavy album, and it's fairly heavy, but I don't like these big hanging chords, slow kind of heavy things out of Blue Öyster Cult. I like when they do a little more complicated and, you know, more quick on their feet sorts of things. And I do rue the couple of guest vocals on it, and you know, Blue Öyster Cult being this weird kind of redo of Subhumans, and Astronomy being not as good as the original Astronomy with the sort of gallop in it now, that sort of thing. And I really don't like the idea of the album closing with Imaginos. It's a weird like production number. It just feels like the end of the play on Broadway where you're supposed to just be uplifted for some reason to send you out of the theater happy kind of thing. So it's this weird funky sort of song. It's got sax in it. It's kind of Zappa-esque to me in a strange way. It's kind of jammy. So yeah, I find I would much rather get the story in its full deluxe form through the way Albert has done it. And I find this pretty unsatisfying. Just screeching, braying sort of Blue Öyster Cult. It's all kind of a little ugly and not very melodic. I do like some of the nice production touches in it in terms of things they added to it. But I think, as Reed mentions, they add too much all the time sort of thing. So yeah, I'm gonna go. I guess I would go 7 out of 10 on this, and because I love Blue Öyster Cult a lot, and I got a lot of 9s and 10s in my list. So this has to go down a little bit of a notch. I probably even like Club Ninja a little bit more, and I definitely like Heaven Forbid quite a bit more. So there you go, 7 out of 10.
Do you like Albert's version better?
Albert's version of this? I don't know, because it's got some negatives too, in it being kind of acoustic and casual, and you know, his singing. Yeah, you're right. I think he's 72 years old now or something like that now. So yeah, it's I would have liked to have seen that done somewhat differently, but I'm super glad it exists, and we do get the strident, whole story put in more of a sensible way, bringing in, everything anybody could find of all this. Just on a side note, it's quite distressing. I was talking to Bull before he had his, I guess it's a stroke, right? Essentially, that he's had. It's too bad. But I was talking to him a little bit about when Sandy died. I guess he wasn't on great terms with his family. And, I tried, I should have tried harder, but I just feel like it almost sounded like all of Sandy's notes and research materials and everything was going to just basically get thrown in a dumpster. So it sounds like we're never going to know much more than what there was. But, again, there wasn't much more, that was directly related to this anyways. The more that would have been better would have been to actually talk to Sandy for 2 or 3 more hours on this and drag more out of him that way on what he envisioned. But it's a little bit of a be careful what you wish for. You want Blue Öyster Cult to snap back from Club Ninja and come back from the pop and the commercialism and do a heavy album. And they do kind of do a heavy album, but it's overbearing. And it's also a little bit be careful what you wish for, because there's a lot of cases like this where some of these bands where we really want to do a concept album, when they finally do it, the fans go, I know we've been asking for that forever, but we're not crazy about it now that it's out. We don't think it's that great. I was a big Clockwork Angels fan when it first came out, and it's kind of faded on me. Dio Magica doesn't do much for me. I don't think Nostradamus does much for anybody. So when these bands finally get around to it, you're kind of usually not happy with the results. Concept albums are hard to make a magical event out of, and I don't think they really did it on here.
Awesome. Well, that was great. Thanks, Martin, and thanks to all of our panelists and to you at home. So it looks like we have an average score of 8.5, okay, which is that's pretty high for a Dark Horse panel. So there we have it for you at home. What do you think of Imagnios? We'd like to know. Put it into the comments. Please join the discussion. The second discussion is always just as much fun as the first. So I want to thank all of our panelists for coming here today. I think this was a great discussion. I want to thank all of you at home for watching. And again, if you like what you're seeing, please subscribe. You can share with your friends, all that stuff that's in the description. But most importantly, we're just happy to have you here, and thanks so much for watching. One last time, thanks to everyone who's here, and everyone have a great day, morning, night, whatever it is. Just have a good one. Thanks, everyone.
See you later.